This is for you, my shining light. May it make your journey a little happier." The bottle arrived on a Tuesday, which was appropriate, because Tuesdays are the universe's way of saying it tried. Martin Foss found it on his doorstep between a soggy pizza flyer and a parcel that was definitely not for him, but which he had already opened because the tape was loose, and the universe had clearly wanted him to. The bottle was small, no bigger than a thumb, made of dark green glass with a cork stopper, and a label so tiny that Martin had to press his nose against it to read the words, which caused him to go momentarily cross-eyed and read it as problem SLOTION before his eyes uncrossed, and he read it properly as problem solution beneath that, in letters so small they appeared to have been written by someone in the middle of an existential crisis about the concept of space. Drink it and your biggest problem disappears. Results may vary. By vary we mean are technically unrelated to your original problem but are objectively worse, which is the joke. Enjoy the joke. Not responsible for bees, Martin read the label 3 times. Then he looked up and down the street, which was empty except for Mrs. Aberworth from number 14 walking her dog, Catastrophe. A name that Martin had always thought was melodramatic, but which he now reconsidered in light of recent events. He went inside. Martin's biggest problem, which was significant enough that it deserves its own paragraph and possibly its own therapist, was that he was about to be evicted. It was not, as evictions go, the most dramatic. He had not been caught running an underground gambling ring or secretly subletting to a colony of raccoons, which would at least have made for a good story. He had simply, over the course of 3 years, accumulated a debt with his landlord, Gerald, that had grown to a size usually associated with small nations, and their disputes with larger ones. Gerald had been patient in the way that geological formations are patient, silent, immovable, and eventually catastrophic. Last Thursday he had delivered a notice in person, tucked it under the door, and then knocked cheerfully and said, "Just dropped something off," in a tone that suggested he considered the whole thing to be a bit of a lark. Martin had 2 weeks. He sat at his kitchen table, a table he technically also owed money on, having purchased it on a payment plan he'd since mentally filed under someone else's problem, and looked at the bottle. He had tried, over the preceding 3 years, a number of solutions to the debt problem. He had tried creating a spreadsheet, which is what people do when they want to understand a problem without doing anything about it. The spreadsheet was extremely detailed and had several color-coded columns and had not, in any material sense, helped. He had tried taking on freelance work, which had paid him £47 over 6 months, 17 of which had been immediately spent celebrating the £47. He had tried calling Gerald to discuss a payment plan, which had gone well in the sense that Gerald had agreed, and then badly in the sense that Martin had agreed to a payment plan he could not maintain, and had then spent 4 months pretending both the plan and Gerald did not exist. He had tried, in one remarkable evening that he recalled with a mixture of shame and genuine respect for his own ingenuity, applying for 17 different grants and bursaries for which he did not qualify, including one for Outer Hebridean crofters, which he had entered on the basis that he was not entirely sure what a crofter was, and felt it was worth a go. The Outer Hebridean Crofters Association had written back promptly and with surprising warmth, declining him, but including a pamphlet about crofting that Martin still had on his bookshelf and found oddly comforting. None of these had worked. The bottle, objectively, had a better hit rate than all of his own strategies combined, and those strategies had cost him considerably more than nothing, which is what the bottle had cost him. "It's clearly a prank," he said aloud, because saying things aloud made them more real, which was a coping mechanism that had served him moderately well throughout his life and catastrophically poorly on at least 4 notable occasions. The bottle said nothing back. "Or it's poison," he continued. "Or it's a very small amount of something that will make me feel vaguely unwell for 3 hours and then fine. Those are the realistic options." He poured himself a glass of water, which he did not drink. Then he poured himself a second glass of water, which he also did not drink. Then he looked at the bottle again, and the bottle looked back at him with the quiet confidence of an object that knew it was about to win. He pulled the cork. The smell that came out was something between lavender and a very old library, which is to say it smelled like good intentions and forgotten knowledge, which should have been the first warning. Martin, who had never in his life been warned by a smell, ignored this entirely and drank the contents in one go. It tasted like a lemon had apologized to him. Nothing happened for approximately 40 seconds, during which Martin sat very still with the expression of a man waiting to be disappointed. Then there was a sound like a very distant bell being rung by someone who thought bells were optional rather than mandatory, and the kitchen filled briefly with a pale gold light that had no visible source and no discernible purpose, and then it was gone. Martin looked around. His kitchen was the same. His table was the same. His pile of unopened letters was the same. His collection of mugs, which he had accumulated across a decade and a half through a combination of gift receiving and the chronic inability to throw things away, remained arranged on the shelf in the precise order of most to least meaningful that he had established in 2017 and maintained with a rigor he applied to almost nothing else in his life. He opened his mouth to say something characteristically defeatist when his phone rang. It was Gerald. Martin. Gerald said, with the enthusiasm of a man who had just come into money, which is a tone that tends to produce a complex emotional response in people who are owed money by the world. Listen, I've had a think, and I'm dropping the whole thing. The debt, the eviction, all of it. Had a chat with my accountant, and apparently it's actually better for me tax-wise if I write it off. So clean slate. Consider yourself sorted. Martin stared at his phone. He began. Fantastic, yes, I know, Gerald said. Right, cheerio, and hung up. Martin sat with his phone in his hand for a long time. Then he set it down very slowly, the way you set things down when you are afraid that moving too quickly will cause reality to notice it made a mistake and come back to correct it. Huh, he said. He waited for the other shoe to drop. Nothing dropped. He waited 5 more minutes. Still nothing. He made a cup of tea, an act of ritual so deeply embedded in his national psyche that it served as his primary response to both minor inconveniences and what appeared to be genuine miracles, and sat down, and felt, for the first time in 3 years, a sensation he could only describe as the absence of dread. It lasted exactly until the following morning. Martin woke at 7:43 a.m. to the sound of something that he initially mistook for a car alarm, then for a child having a disagreement with a cat, and then, as consciousness assembled itself grudgingly into something that resembled coherent thought, identified as geese. There were geese in his flat, not one goose. Not a manageable, literary number of geese like 2 or 3 that might be explained by a window left open and a particularly determined migratory instinct. There were, and Martin counted, because he was the sort of person who counted things even in crisis, which was either a strength or a coping mechanism that had become indistinguishable from 11 geese. They were distributed throughout his flat with the casual authority of creatures that have decided a space belongs to them and are mildly baffled by the prior occupant's presence. One of them was on the kitchen table, standing directly in the center of it in the way that a very small tyrant occupies a throne. One was in the bath. 3 were engaged in a territorial dispute over the area rug that Martin had also purchased on a payment plan, and which was now being reconsidered as a battleground. Right, said Martin. He called animal control. Animal control put him on hold for 22 minutes, during which a goose ate his phone charger. Another one knocked his tea off the counter with what appeared to be deliberate satisfaction, and the one in the bath discovered the tap. When the animal control operative finally came on, she listened to Martin's description, asked him to confirm the number of geese 3 times in an increasingly disbelieving tone, and then told him there was a 4 to 6 week waiting list and suggested he keep them calm in the meantime. Do I keep geese calm? Martin asked. Make eye contact, the operative said and hung up. Martin spent the next 4 days living alongside 11 geese in a state of negotiated coexistence that resembled, in many ways, a very bad flat share. The geese were loud. The geese were opinionated. The geese, it turned out, had extremely firm views on the question of who owned the sofa, and those views did not include Martin. He called in sick to work. His supervisor, a woman named Janet who had the energy of someone who had once read a book about mindfulness and decided it made her medically superior to stress, told him that he could not call in sick for geese and that he needed to think carefully about his priorities. Martin looked at the goose that was sitting on his laptop. "I am thinking about my priorities," he said. Janet took a breath that contained, in Martin's assessment, approximately 400 words that she had chosen commendably not to say. "Fine, one day, but Martin, and I say this genuinely, you need to sort yourself out." Martin looked at the committee in the hallway, who had recently been joined by the bath goose and appeared to be expanding their operations. "Yes," he said, "I'm working on it." On day 5, in an act of what he would later describe to his GP as either ingenuity or psychological collapse, possibly both, Martin constructed an internal perimeter using his IKEA bookshelves, 2 dining chairs, and a shower curtain he'd been meaning to replace since 2019. This successfully confined 9 of the 11 geese to the living room. The remaining 2 had, through means he preferred not to investigate, established themselves as some sort of ambassadorial presence in the kitchen and refused to be relocated. Martin tried 3 times, on the 3rd attempt with oven gloves, and decided that the outcome was not worth the cost to his dignity. He named them, because naming things is what humans do when they cannot control them. The kitchen geese became Gerald and Gerald too, a choice that he found personally satisfying and that the geese appeared indifferent to. On day 8, he remembered the bottle. He found it on the windowsill where he had left it. He picked it up and shook it. Empty. He turned it over looking for more instructions. On the bottom, in the same microscopic font that had required near-concussive proximity before, were the words, "One use per customer. Problem removal is permanent. Replacement problem is also permanent but frankly more interesting. Enjoy." "Enjoy," Martin repeated, with a specific intonation that the English language has developed over centuries precisely for situations in which a small inanimate object has said something deeply offensive. He looked at Gerald, who was standing on the counter eating what appeared to be a lettuce that Martin definitely did not own and had not purchased, and whose presence in the flat remained, to this day, unexplained. Geese, Martin had learned over the past week and a half, apparently did not require explanatory frameworks. They simply were, with the complete self-assurance of something that had never once questioned its right to exist in whatever space it happened to occupy. "You," Martin informed Gerald, "are not interesting. You are a goose." Gerald honked. It was, Martin had to admit, an extremely confident honk. 3 weeks into the goose occupation, Martin had developed a routine. He woke at 7, made tea while narrating the morning news to Gerald, and Gerald too in the tone of a man who has accepted his circumstances, but would like the record to reflect that he has not endorsed them. He fed the geese, not because he wanted to feed the geese, but because a goose that is not being fed is a goose that is considering alternative revenue streams, and those streams invariably involved his furniture. He had learned, through the specific educational methodology of having it happen to him twice, that geese who felt under-resourced would begin systematically destroying soft furnishings in a way that was less vandalism and more philosophical statement. He had also, in a development that surprised him considerably, begun to find the geese company, not pleasant company, not the company you choose, but company nonetheless, in the way that a very loud and opinionated clock is company, present, impossible to ignore, and occasionally useful for reminding you that time is passing, and you are failing to do anything meaningful with it. The geese, for their part, appeared to have developed a grudging tolerance for Martin that stopped just short of warmth. Gerald, too, had, on 2 separate occasions, allowed Martin to sit on his own sofa without comment, which felt like progress. The wardrobe geese had relocated voluntarily to the space under the bed, which was technically worse for Martin's sleep quality, but significantly better for the shirts. The committee Geese had stopped operating as a committee and had fragmented into smaller interest groups, which Martin found marginally less unsettling even though he was aware this was not an objectively correct response. He started working from home full-time, a request his supervisor Janet granted with barely concealed relief, as apparently his physical presence in the office had been bringing down the energy, a phrase that made Martin want to ask several pointed follow-up questions, but which he let pass. He set up his desk in the kitchen, between Gerald and Gerald too, and found that they made surprisingly good colleagues. They did not attend his Zoom calls uninvited, except once memorably, when Gerald appeared in the background of a strategy meeting and was immediately identified by Martin's colleague Priya as the most senior person on this call. And they did not make passive-aggressive comments about the communal microwave, and they did not, unlike his previous colleagues, eat his lunch. They did eat several important documents, but Martin maintained that those documents had been stressful, and perhaps this was better for everyone. He began, around week 4, to photograph the geese. Not as a decision, but as an accumulation. First, one photograph taken as evidence, for some future tribunal at which the bottle would be held accountable, and then a second because the light was interesting, and a third because Gerald too was doing something with a pen that had a quality the word, majestic, would have fit had it not been so undermined by context. He posted the third photograph online with no caption and went to bed. He woke to 47 comments and a request from a wildlife magazine asking if they could use the image. Martin stared at this for several minutes. Then he looked at Gerald too, who was performing his morning assessment of the counter with the focused attention of a building inspector who had concerns. Apparently photogenic, Martin told him. Gerald too knocked a pen off the counter. This was, Martin had come to understand, Gerald too's primary means of expressing the full spectrum of his emotional range. The animal control woman finally called back in week 6. She had a slot available on a Thursday. Martin held the phone and looked around his flat, which was, he was startled to realize, significantly cleaner than it had been before the geese arrived, possibly because the geese had a strong disapproval of clutter, evidenced by the fact that they had sorted most of his belongings into 2 categories: things to sit on and things to eat. Both of these categories had been actioned with a thoroughness that Martin had never applied to any organizational system he had personally attempted. He looked at Gerald, who was looking back at him with the particular expression geese have, which is less expression and more geological formation that has decided to pass judgment. "Right," said Martin to no one in particular. "Week 6, he paused. "She has a slot on Thursday." Gerald said nothing. Gerald too knocked a pen off the counter. Martin did not call animal control back. He told himself this was because it was a very complicated process, and he had a report due, and also because the form they'd asked him to fill in online was 17 pages long and kept logging him out at page 12. These were all true. They were not, however, the reason. The reason was that his flat was no longer quiet in a way that pressed on him. The reason was that he had, accidentally and against considerable resistance, become a man who had 11 geese and a very specific morning routine, and colleagues, questionable colleagues, colleagues with wings and boundary issues and a deep philosophical opposition to alarm clocks, but colleagues nonetheless. The reason was that his biggest problem had gone, and what had arrived instead was loud and absurd and permanent, and the bottle had been quite clear on this point. Interesting. Interesting, it turned out, was not nothing. In month 3, his neighbor from the flat below, a man named Doug who had, until recently, communicated exclusively through notes slid under the door reading things like "Please control the honking," and "If this continues I will speak to the management," and once, a single sheet of paper on which was written only the word Y in letters that suggested Doug owned, or possibly had made, a very large pen, knocked on his door in person and asked. With the air of a man who had been internally debating this question for some time, if he could see the geese, Martin showed him the geese. Doug looked at the geese for a long time. The geese looked back. The committee geese, who had reconvened for the occasion, assessed Doug with the professional dispassion of a panel reviewing an unexpected application. Doug did not make eye contact, which Martin later told him was the correct instinct. Then Doug said, "I used to have a dog," in the tone that people say things they have been carrying around for years, and Martin said, "Do you want a cup of tea?" And Doug said yes, and they sat in the kitchen with Gerald and Gerald too and didn't say much, and it was the most comfortable Martin had felt in a very long time. Doug came back on Thursday, and the Thursday after that. He learned, eventually, not to make eye contact with Gerald, who had strong and immediate opinions about eye contact, and to always bring something for Gerald too, who had been identified early as the more diplomatic of the two and who could occasionally be negotiated with, in the sense that he would accept a biscuit in exchange for not actively obstructing whatever you were trying to do. "You know," Doug said one evening, watching Gerald too systematically dismantle a coaster that had done nothing to deserve it, "I've been thinking about what's technically your problem here." "Have you?" said Martin, "and I think the framing is off." Doug accepted a cup of tea. "A problem implies something you're trying to solve. Are you trying to solve this?" Martin thought about the animal control form. He thought about page 12 where it had logged him out. He thought about how he had not in 3 months tried to reach page 13. "No," he said. "Then it's not a problem," Doug said, with the confidence of someone who has resolved something. "It's just your life." Gerald honked from the other room, which was either confirmation or a territorial dispute with the bookshelf. It was genuinely difficult to tell. The Wildlife magazine published the photograph of Gerald too with the pen. It got picked up by 3 other publications. Someone sent Martin a message asking where they could buy prints. Martin, who had not considered this, looked into it, found that it was straightforward, set up a print shop, and then stared at his bank account a week later with the expression of a man who has discovered that geese are, against all reasonable expectation, financially viable. That was the thing about the potion, Martin thought later, much later, in year 2, by which point he had a small Instagram account dedicated to the geese that had 17,000 followers, and a partnership with a sustainable pet food company that was paying him considerably more than his actual job. A development that he had reported to Janet in a resignation letter he had spent considerable time crafting, and then decided was too gloating and rewritten 3 times before landing on something that was still, if he was honest, a little bit gloating, that it hadn't lied. It had said the problem would disappear. It had. It had said the replacement would be technically unrelated. It was 11 geese had nothing to do with rent arrears, except insofar as the geese had become, improbably and through a chain of events that no reasonable person could have predicted, the mechanism by which he was now comfortably paying rent without difficulty. It had said the replacement problem would be permanent. It was. Gerald showed no signs of leaving. Gerald, too, had recently been identified by a wildlife photographer who'd seen the Instagram account as an unusually large example of the species, and had asked if Martin would consider him for a study, which Martin had declined on Gerald too's behalf on the grounds that Gerald too had made his opinions about strangers extremely clear, specifically through a demonstration involving a stranger's umbrella and a level of precision that had suggested premeditation. And it had said the replacement would be interesting. This, Martin had to concede, was simply and unambiguously true, because no part of his life before the geese had ever caused a stranger to sit across from him in a morning television studio. He had been invited onto a segment called Britain's Most Unusual Housemates, which he had agreed to mostly out of a sense of cosmic obligation, and say, in all seriousness, "But do you think they love you?" Martin had thought about this. "I think," he said carefully, with the manner of a man who has learned to choose his words precisely, because he lives with 11 geese who have opinions about inaccuracy, "that they have decided I am part of the territory, and that's probably as close as we're going to get." Gerald, who had been brought to the studio in a carrier against considerable protest, and who was currently sitting on the host's desk in a way that strongly implied he considered it his desk now, honked once. The studio audience laughed. Martin looked at Gerald. Gerald looked back at Martin with the geological patience of something that had already won, and was simply waiting for the other party to acknowledge it. Martin had a sudden, very clear memory of the bottle, of the kitchen table, of 2 weeks' notice and the weight of 3 years of dread that had sat on him like furniture, heavy, present, inescapable, arranged around him in a way that made moving feel impossible. He remembered how the absence of it had felt like a scuffed wall. He remembered thinking that he'd feel lighter, and instead feeling blank, and then worrying that he didn't know how to exist without the weight, which had turned out to be a legitimate concern, but one that 11 Geese had addressed through the extremely direct method of replacing the weight with something entirely different, heavier in some ways, lighter in others, and substantially louder throughout. All of that dread was gone. In its place, 11 geese, one neighbor, 17,000 strangers on the internet, a sustainable pet food partnership, a television appearance, a wildlife magazine, a print shop, and the quiet and entirely unexpected company of 2 geese named Gerald in a kitchen that smelled, always, faintly of old libraries and something that had once apologized to him. Somewhere, Martin suspected, something was laughing. He suspected it was the bottle. He suspected, and this was the part he found hardest to admit, because he was, at his core, a person who preferred to be in a state of mild grievance about the universe and its management. He suspected the bottle had known exactly what it was doing. Not in the sense of malice, but in the sense of a very experienced gardener who plants something completely wrong for the climate and soil and available light, and then watches it grow into something the garden books don't have a name for, and finds this entirely satisfactory. Responsible for bees, he murmured. Gerald, too, looked at him. Don't, said Martin. But he was already looking at his phone, where a notification had arrived from an account he followed called Small Unusual Objects That Probably Shouldn't Exist, in which someone had posted a photo of a very small dark green bottle on their doorstep, cork still in, labeled too small to read from the photograph's distance. They had commented beneath it, anyone else getting these? There were 43 replies. Martin scrolled through them. Several people had received bottles. One person had already drunk theirs and reported that their crippling social anxiety had resolved completely, replaced by what they described as an unshakable certainty that I am being followed by a very small but committed cloud, which is not the same as anxiety but is definitely something. Another had drunk theirs and found that their chronic insomnia had vanished, which was excellent, except that they had simultaneously developed the ability to hear colors, which they reported was manageable during the day but made evenings complicated because purple was apparently quite loud. A third person had simply replied, I drank mine 3 weeks ago, and I want everyone to know that I'm fine and the ducks are fine, and we've reached an agreement and please stop asking. Martin stared at this for a long time. Then he put his phone face down on the table, in the manner of a man who has made a decision not to be involved in whatever was about to happen to someone else. He picked up his tea. He looked at Gerald. Gerald looked back. Good luck to them, Martin said. He meant it. He did also briefly wonder about the bees, but some things Martin had learned were better left as open questions. The universe, it turned out, was not a problem to be solved. It was closer to a flat share with 11 geese. Loud, unreasonable, occasionally catastrophic, and if you were very still and very honest about it, in the way that you could only be honest about things at 7 in the morning with a cup of tea and 2 geese named Gerald, and a kitchen that smelled faintly of apologies, worth it. Gerald, too, knocked a pen off the counter. Martin did not pick it up. He was learning. Thanks for listening until the end. Please like and subscribe.